This is a very important amendment, and it has to do with the fact that everybody in our country is concerned that we have today a $12 trillion national debt, and everybody in this country is concerned that this year we're going to run up the largest deficit in the history of this country. And what that means is that the taxpayers of our country rightfully and absolutely want to know that the money that we expend, whether it is for defense, which is what we are discussing this evening, whether it's for housing, education, or any other purpose, they want to know that every nickel of federal dollars that is spent is expended as wisely and as cost-effectively as possible. They also want to know that the corporations and the institutions and the individuals who receive that federal funding are honest and trustworthy in terms of how they can expend those federal dollars. That's what the people want, and they certainly have every right for those expectations. Mr. President, several weeks ago, as you'll recall, the Senate voted to prohibit any funding going to an organization called ACORN. And that decision was largely motivated by a videotape which showed employees of ACORN involved in an outrageous and absurd discussion with actors who were posing, as I understand it, as a prostitute and a pimp. And those employees, appropriately enough, were fired for their outrageous behavior. Now, my understanding is that over a period of 15 years, ACORN has received about $53 million to promote affordable housing, encourage voter registration, do other things. $53 million over a 15-year period. Mr. President, I voted against that ACORN resolution, obviously not because I condone the behavior of these employees or other problems associated with that organization over the years. I don't. I opposed it because we need a process to determine what the criteria are in terms of defunding an organization engaged in improper or illegal behavior. And frankly, I don't think a videotape on TV is good enough justification. We need a process, and that's what this amendment is about. Mr. President, the sad truth of the matter is that virtually every major defense contractor in this country has, for a period of many years, been engaged in systemic, illegal, and fraudulent behavior while receiving hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer money. Mr. President, we're not talking here about the $53 million that ACORN received over 15 years. We are talking about defense contractors who have received many, many billions of dollars in defense contracts, and year after year, time after time, have violated the law, ripping off the taxpayers of this country big time. And in some instances, these contractors have done more than steal money from taxpayers. In some instances, they have actually endangered the lives and well-being of the men and women who serve our country in the armed forces. Let me give you just a few examples of what I'm talking about. According to the Project on Government Oversight, a nonpartisan, widely respected organization focusing on government waste, the three largest government defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman, all have a history riddled with fraud and other illegal behavior. Combined, these companies have engaged in 109 instances of misconduct just since 1995, just going back to 1995, 109 instances of misconduct, and have paid fees and settlements for this misconduct totaling $2.9 billion. Let me repeat that. These three companies, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman, have engaged in 109 instances of misconduct just since 1995 and have paid fees and settlements for this misconduct totaling $2.9 billion. And here is the kicker. Despite violating the law time after time after time, despite being fined time after time after time, guess what the penalty has been? Well, here's what the penalty is. It's a pretty harsh penalty. In 2007, their punishment was $77 billion in government contracts. Now, that's a pretty steep penalty. I have to admit that. $77 billion. This is not Acorn. They would be funded immediately. 2-minute videotape. These are guys who time after time violated the law, ripped off the taxpayers of this country, and their punishment was, in 2007, 1 year alone. Not 53 million over 15 years, 77 billion in 1 year. Now, based on a video on TV, we took away the funding for Acorn. What are we going to do with the major defense contractors who have been found guilty in courts of law, not on a videotape, in courts of law time after time? Now, Mr. President, let me give you just a few specifics, just so we know what we're talking about here. Lockheed Martin, the largest defense contractor in our country, has engaged in 50 instances of misconduct since 1995, paying fines and settlements totaling $577 million. Yet it received $34 billion in government contracts in 2007. That's really telling them who's boss. That's really sticking it to them for violating the law. And here's the type of behavior that we're talking about. According to the U.S. Attorney's Office, in 2008, Lockheed Martin's Space Systems Company paid $10.5 million to settle charges that it defrauded the government by submitting false invoices for payment on a multi-billion-dollar contract connected to the Titan IV space launch vehicle program. According to the Department of Justice in 2003, Lockheed Martin paid $38 million to resolve allegations that it fraudulently inflated the cost of performing several Air Force contracts for the purchase and navigation and targeting pods for military jets. And in 2001, Lockheed Martin paid $8.5 million to settle criminal charges that it lied about its costs when negotiating contracts for the repair and restoration of radar pedestals installed in U.S. warships. But in fairness to Lockheed Martin, we should be clear that they are not the only defense contractors involved in fraud. Frankly, it is endemic in the industry. And let me give you another example. Boeing. Boeing is the world's largest aerospace company and the largest manufacturer of commercial jetliners and military aircrafts. Since 1995, Mr. President, Boeing has either been found guilty, liable, or reached settlements in 31 instances of misconduct, and as a result, paid $1.5 billion in fines, judgments, and settlement. $1.5 billion. You're talking about real money. In 2000, for example, according to the Department of Justice, Boeing agreed to pay $54 million to settle charges that it placed defective gears in more than 140 CH-47D Chinook helicopters and then sold these defective helicopters to the United States Army. When one of the gears failed in flight, it caused an Army Chinook helicopter to crash and burn while on a mission in Honduras. And, Mr. President, 5 servicemen aboard were killed. So we're not just talking about fraud here. We're talking about activities which resulted in the death of U.S. servicemen. And a report made public just this past Tuesday, the DOD inspector reported that Boeing may have recovered $271 million in quote-unquote unallowable costs from the government. That's this last Tuesday. Still, Boeing received $24 billion in federal contracts in 2007. And finally, Northrop Grumman, the third largest contractor, has a similar history with 27 instances of misconduct totaling $790 million over the past 15 years. But it's not just the big three. On June 9th, 2004, KBR, it was discovered, KBR overbilled for dining facilities by at least 19%, according to KBR's own studies, and it could be as high as 36%. As reported in its 2010-K, the government eventually agreed to withhold $55 million from KBR. United Technologies reached a settlement amounting to over $50 million. So here we are, Mr. President. Just to reiterate, a few weeks ago, the Senate voted to strip funding for an organization called Acorn, which received $53 million in federal funds for a period of 15 years. What do we do with some of the largest defense contractors in this country who have time after time after time been involved with fraud? And, Mr. President, I think one has got to be pretty obtuse not to perceive that this type of behavior, this recurrent behavior, is systemic in the industry and that it is part of the overall business model. And let me just add, what I've described now is what these companies have been caught doing. We don't know what they have done in which they have not been caught. Mr. President, the time is long overdue for us to get to the bottom of this situation. We owe that not only to the taxpayers of this country, but to the men and women in our armed forces. For that reason, I am proposing an amendment today under which the Secretary of Defense would calculate the total amount of money that goes to companies that have engaged in fraud against the United States, and then make recommendations about how to penalize repeat offenders. In other words, they have got to be held accountable. It is absurd that year after year, these companies continue doing the same things, illegal behavior, fraudulent activities, and year after year, they keep getting away with it, and year after year, they come back and they get hundreds of billions of dollars in federal funds. Mr. President, I hope very much that the study will receive strong bipartisan support and will be a first step in moving us forward to cleaning up the world of defense contracting.